Okay, welcome fellow missionaries. This is Artie Pingle from Mission Project Service on the first in what we're calling a mini webinar series. And as you can see, the title for the series is Understanding How Funders Are Different. Understanding how funders are different. There's thousands of funders out there. And I think if we approach it with an understanding that many of them fall into separate, distinct categories, it can help us look at the entire funding landscape. Let's take a look at understanding how funders are different. You know, why did we pick that as a topic? Why? Well, the goal of MPS is to make all of you out there in your work more efficient, more effective, and more strategic. And part of that, remember, is the model that we follow at MPS is what's called project cycle management. So all of you, wherever you're at, you have your mission. And during the course of that mission, you identify needs. Then you actually formulate a project to address that needs. And then this is where MPS comes in. In that cycle, you need to obtain funding, and then you implement the project and you evaluate it. And then I add, because you won't see this on project cycle management models out there, I say you're willing to modify. So knowing that this is the context, it is worth knowing about the type of funders out there, because many of them, almost all of them will ask you to evaluate. Many of them will even ask you to modify. They'll be watching your implementation of it. They'll want to understand your mission. So all of these things are good to have in mind as we understand that different funders require different levels of all of these. So obviously we're dealing with funding. So funders, what are we looking at? They're the same in a few different ways. They'll tell you what they fund. They'll tell you, or you can usually find out how much. And then you can usually find out what the procedures are. The procedures might be awful, almost meant to keep you away, but nonetheless, they all have some kind of procedures. But let's proceed, and this webinar, mini webinar series proceeds from the view that they're all different. They may fall into some general different categories, but even within that, they're different. And why? Well, they all have different strategies. They have different histories. Some of these foundations are hundreds of years old. Some are 10 years old. They have different culture. Some are very dominated by young people. Some, it's the same older family members that got together 20 or 30 years that are still in the room today. Some are structured differently. They give votes to family members. Some wait for the staff to recommend, and they just basically give an okay. So in some cases, the staff or the board are different. They're also different in terms of how they engage project cycle management. Some of them really look for a more sophisticated understanding from all of you. Some, as we'll talk shortly about, are very different. Now, to understand all these differences, you can go to their website, you can make a personal visit, and we'll talk about all of these over the course of our mini webinars. You can go to their website, you can make a personal visit if possible. You can use third-party research. That could be any number of fundraising consultants. I'll talk about one source called GuideStar that I think is very helpful. You can use an organization like us, MPS. We can tell you where the funds are and give you some basic guidance about how to move forward. And frankly, you can talk to other missionaries. Chances are each of you know somebody who has applied to a foundation successfully, gotten a grant, and they can tell you what that felt like, what the process is like, what feedback they got. So you can learn from other missionaries. So as we move ahead in this webinar series based on Mission Project Service, our consultants, my experience, and missionaries like you out there, there appear to be about really 6 different kinds of funders that you're going to encounter over the course of your career as a grant writer or as an advisor for your congregation or diocese. The first of these are the smaller, what I call the one and done foundations. In the sense they're very simple, what they are going to do. They're very clear about what they do. They're probably the easiest of the foundations to work with. The second one are the ones who are still smaller, but they have this integral concern. They would be ones that really value the project cycle management approach, and that will make things perhaps a little bit more difficult, but there are rewards that go along with their difficulty. A third would be the large foundations. They have a lot of money to give away. They give small grants and they give large grants away. And they're almost all integral. They're almost all professionally staffed and follow the project cycle management model. Third, a separate group I call church administered, and I say Episcopal here, because the bishop, the local ordinary, and in some cases, the superior of the congregation is particularly important. Their approval and their endorsement is particularly important. So those are church administered. 5 will be government, and government is going to include individual funds that particular governments has set up, as well as embassies and other government-run or government-supported NGOs. And then finally, we have what are called mega foundations. Some of those names easily come to mind. Actually, the largest is Novo Nordisk out of Denmark. Second, and this always surprises a lot of people, second is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then third is the IKEA Foundation, that furniture company. So all of those, you might say, well, what would I ever have to do with getting funding from them? You might be surprised, but we'll talk about that. That's the mega foundation. I originally said one and done, and then when I started working at it, I thought a better way to state it is clearly defined. Now, these are typically grants for $5,000 to $20,000. So relatively speaking, small grants. And the smaller foundations, oftentimes they give many small grants, fewer large grants. And in their reporting, what they're just asking for is honesty and accountability. So they're going to be very clearly defined as to what they will fund. I say in fact, they prefer it. They prefer an easily understood and measured type of project. You can imagine what I'm thinking. You're going to build something. You want a motorbike to reach people in your parish. You want to drill a borehole for water, or you want to buy books for students. So the foundation will offer those clear criteria. I use this sort of little indicator. This is the foundation, and all they're looking is for you, the missionary, to come to them. That's what they're looking for. You'll see the difference as we move ahead, but they're very clear and straightforward. And you'll find a lot of these. In fact, probably for your benefit, if your needs are small, most of these foundations are small, operate this way. I'll just mention a few of them right now. The Loyola Foundation operates this way. The Koch Foundation, that's K-O-C-H. Advenia, Kirchenot, Pastoral Mission Fund, Catholic Human Services Foundation, Hilton Fund for Sisters, the International Foundation, and MIVA, the various MIVAs that are out there. So now some of these smaller foundations are, and they're harder to get into, but for the most of them, in fact, all the ones I mentioned, that's very clear what you have to do and what you have to apply to. So that's the smaller and clearly defined. Second is the smaller foundations that have integral priorities. Now, these foundations tend to be aware, they want to be aware of the local and regional issues that you live with. One of these foundations, for example, when I had talked to them about India, they had a very detailed understanding, for example, of the Dalit or caste population and how that was impacted there. It's not something that, it was the first time, for example, that I heard a foundation board member talk with that much detailed knowledge like that. So this type of foundation does care about that. They seek strategic impact even though they cannot compare to a mega or a large foundation. They can be seen to favor human development versus pastoral, but not always. Now, the good news about this, because they tend to be concerned with the integral part of what we were talking about, of that in our project cycle management, they understand that the needs you're trying to address are ongoing. They're not looking necessarily to be one clearly defined project and move on. They're open to hearing from you that this is an ongoing need. In that respect, I have found some of these foundations open to multi-year support. Now, whereas the other foundations tended to want a report by way of showing accountability, The foundations here want accountability for sure, and they want to know, for example, how the money was spent, but they also want to show evidence of impact. They want to have that impact. So if it's measurable or if it's more anecdotal, they want to somehow see the difference that their funding has made. So we use this. Here's the foundation. They're sending messages out to you about what they want, and then they're asking you to send things in. So today we dealt with the smaller foundations. And oh, by the way, the classic example that I would give, it's a foundation that is much beloved, would be the Raskob Foundation for Catholic Activities, RFCA, located in the United States in Wilmington. Very sophisticated, open to smaller grants, open to a little bit larger grants. Love to have a visit. If you're in town, they really want to engage and they really care and they're really smart in what they're trying to do. You know, as I said before, you know, the larger foundations out there, and a good example might be, for example, the Hilton Foundation and the Hilton Fund for Sisters. The Hilton Fund for Sisters is a smaller foundation that has clearly defined grant projects that they're looking for. And they operate both as an integrally connected foundation and also as a clearly defined foundation. But the larger Hilton Foundation is a very good example that it's extremely integral. They're absolutely concerned with every part. And I can say this having gone through the process with them, which is a very lengthy process. They are concerned with every part of project cycle management. So what are the characteristics of these larger ones? You have to have a larger need and typically cover a larger area. I think one of the reasons that we may have qualified in years past is because we're trying to help all of you, literally 500,000 missionaries out there, larger area, the world. So we sort of met that. They have a longer application process and they do seek an ongoing relationship. So for example, our application process really took place over 8 months and involved a couple of in-person meetings. And the good news is, much like a commitment over that period of time, it was an ongoing relationship. So we continue to stay in touch. And that is not only talking about what we're doing with the grant, but it's their inquiring about what our ongoing needs are. So a relationship with a larger foundation can be a good one, not just in terms of the amount of support you get, but the amount of time, the commitment of a potential funding relationship. The foundation, however, might be more directive. It will have clear opinions about, for example, how to address malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, or what type of pastoral efforts it wants in a given situation. It also may impose or strongly urge you to do certain things that conform to other issues that are important to them. For example, climate change. I know foundations now that are requiring some indication of an attempt to use solar panels, for example, in terms of generating power. And they certainly make it clear that they favor applications that implement new technology for climate change. But that's an example of them being more directive. Sometimes it's harder to initiate with them because many of them will say, we only deal with the clients that we deal with, or they will not publish a formal application process, and they make it pretty difficult. There you either need to get an introduction from someone who has worked with the foundation or someone who knows somebody in the foundation, or a recommendation, or they may come to know about you. We got a grant once from the Ford Foundation because one of the board members of the Ford Foundation was a friend of one of our missionaries. It was no more nor no less than that. And knowing that person helped us get in, they then agreed with a particular project that we were working on, which happened to be, it wasn't NPS, it was a program of dialogue with Islam. And interfaith dialogue was particularly important to the Ford Foundation at that time, just as an example. But they'll oftentimes look for innovation. So if you do feel that you have something that is really new in addressing an unmet problem, this might be a great home for you on that. Sometimes they may want to innovate to the point of even missing out on what the real problem is, We had a situation once where in dealing with schools in Haiti, they said they wanted something new and innovative. And new and innovative, for those of you who have been in Haiti, doesn't necessarily work that well. What works is being there day after day, day in, day out, taking care of these kids, some cases taking care of their parents, but teaching them basic literacy skills, basic mathematics skills. So it's that kind of commitment. So here what you have is, to use a better example for the larger ones, here's the foundation. They will oftentimes have field agents. For example, the Porticus Foundation. They have agents in Europe, in Canada, in Africa, and in the United States. These particular field agents, they're looking to find organizations that match the priorities of their foundation, and they're inviting applications in. Sometimes people will bypass the field agents. It doesn't mean you'll fail, but if you don't go through there, you go directly to the foundation in one of its offices there too. Now let's move on to the church-administered foundations. And what I mean by church-administered is that there's going to be some clergy or somebody specifically part of the institutional Catholic Church that is involved in the grant process, either receiving the application, writing the rules for it, administering it, approving it. So here I'm talking about things like Caritas, Catholic Relief Services, those two work together, as you know, a variety of archdioceses. For example, in Europe, some archdioceses over there are very significant. Propagation of the Faith, otherwise known as Propaganda Fide, and then the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. They have various committees that act like foundations. The Papal Foundation itself, which is administered out of the Vatican, but was actually started by a number of wealthy Americans. But it is, at this point, definitely influenced by the church in its process. So what do I mean by some of these? First of all, the applicant's first priority for any of you looking for a church-administered, 100%, make sure you have the support of your local bishop. Oftentimes, it's a little less true with Caritas and CRS, but certainly with all of these, you're going to need the approval of your local, what's called a local ordinary, which would be your bishop or archbishop. In the case of the Papal Foundation, it isn't just the local bishop, it will also be the papal nuncio that serves your area as well. But support of your bishop, very important. That would be number one. I would characterize all of these as well-developed. By that, I mean that they've been operating for decades, if not hundreds of years. Well-developed, well-intentioned, and welcoming. They want to give money away. They really, and they feel like this is part of their duty and obligation, which is slightly different, for example, than an individual that might set up a foundation but wants to be a little bit careful about how that's managed. They give both small and large projects. So you can find people in here that will address small needs and large needs. For example, when the earthquake hit Haiti about 10 years ago, the two largest funders were the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, together with CRS, but also the Archdiocese of Cologne, Germany. So they can be very significant players in this. There's often a high approval rate too. Many of these give away many more grants and perhaps at a smaller size. You'll see that with the U.S. Bishops' committees for Latin America, for Central or Eastern Europe. At the same time, I think it's either the Archdiocese of Cologne or another has about an 80% success rate. So almost everybody that applies, or a good number of those who apply, get approved. So you get a high approval rate, which should encourage you. They're mostly project-centered, which is also good news. You find out what it is they're looking for. Except CRS and Caritas, they bring their own priorities into a particular country where they're going. So there will be the need to dialogue with their in-country representatives. And you'll find that both for Caritas and for CRS. And then finally, funding amounts can fluctuate. Whereas a foundation will be guided by what's called the prudent investor rule, which means they give away not to exceed 5%, because sometimes their investments go higher than 5%, sometimes they go down. Many of these are funded through collections from the people in the pew. So there have been times, for example, when collections have gone down during various scandals in the church, during times of financial crisis, the collections have gone down, and the amount that they've been able to give has at times gone down. So anyway, those are church administered. Pay attention to that. Again, don't forget number 1. And now we go to government. All of you have your operations in one country or another. All of you have your mother houses or your general headquarters in one country or another. And you're all probably in many parts around the world. But for the project you're concerned about getting funded, you can look at government's presence in that nation. Now, let's take Zambia, for example. That is a big country for the missionary oblates that I work closely with, or Haiti for that matter. They're very big in both those countries. Neither of those countries have a lot of resources themselves, but both of them have embassies. So embassies from all around the world, US, Japan, most of the more Western and developed countries will have embassies, and each of those embassies is given a discretionary amount of money. So I would definitely encourage relationships. I remember that this was in one of our African countries. There was a missionary oblate bishop. Very shortly after he became bishop, he literally made visits to the various embassies and actually developed good relationships with Norway, Sweden, and I think Denmark, and ended up getting nearly every year some type of discretionary grant from those embassies. So I would definitely call your attention. It is worth a visit. Now, when we talk about government, they all have national initiatives. And I would say this, they're almost all around human development. Sometimes there's a trend now for some of the countries that are supporting Africa to look at roads. There are other countries that we've worked with, for example, in Haiti and some of the Caribbean countries, big focus on healthcare and education. Find out what these are. You'll find out about those through the embassy, through embassy staff. It isn't difficult to get an appointment. You might have to wait, but you can ask for an appointment to meet with one of the program officers. You can also go to CRS, Caritas, and in terms of being from the U.S., your USAID rep. And they will be able to tell you what are the initiatives that the countries that are trying to support the given country where you are, what they're trying to do. And I'll give you an example of how that can work out very positively. I know of a congregation that just started an initiative dealing with Muslim refugees in Western Sahara. They met with Caritas about this. Caritas ended up giving them a grant of nearly $100,000. And now with the Caritas representative, they're also going to be visiting with a few embassies in Western Sahara to find out for those countries that are concerned about the migrant, the homeless population, the Muslim diaspora, if you will, that is increasing in population in Western Sahara. So that's an example of how that can play out. I put down ASHA here, and it's an American fund, but it stands for American Schools and Hospitals Abroad. It's what I call big risk, big reward, in the sense that they don't make as many grants, but the grants that they do make are very large. I know of only one grant where we have succeeded with them, and that was for a school in the Philippines. It was actually a college. It was a very large grant that they made for that. But it is a very long process. If you have a school or a hospital in a country, before going through the application process, I would talk to a USAID rep. I would talk with, Catholic Relief Services would probably know the people to talk to as well in your country, and you'll find out if there's interest or even potential interest. I would say the degree to which ASHA and some of these other government human development initiatives are funded can vary greatly depending on who's in office. During the 4 years of President Trump in the United States, there was a real chill on funding that did not necessarily have a national security interest. So a concern for America through their foreign aid to impact human development projects was not nearly as active under President Trump as it was before under President Obama, but importantly, as it will be, we believe, under President Biden, where there's a renewed interest in the impact, the human development impact of United States foreign aid. You have that already. You see that where regarding Afghanistan, for example, Secretary of State Blinken talked about the importance of diplomacy over military operations. Similarly, the public relations work of human development. So this is a process around the national initiatives and ASHA. And finally, I make a note here, and it's just hospitality and relationship. You don't necessarily have to worry about having the most eloquent or well thought out program at the beginning. Basically, if you just try to develop a relationship with some of these embassy staff, some of the people, the CRS representatives in your country, the Caritas representatives, for most of them, they're far from home. All of the embassy personnel, for example, the official personnel are going to come from the US or Germany or France or Japan or Kuwait, wherever it is, and they're in the embassy in your country. They're far from home. Particularly for those who are from your home country, there's probably a real appreciation if they're able to spend some time. A home-cooked meal, for example, is greatly appreciated. I don't want to waste your time on this, but I know country after country where that sense of a relationship and being sensitive to the fact they're far from home began and became the basis for a very cordial relationship. The last note I have there is that it often changes by administration. That's just really sort of, I made that point already under ASHA. But that tells you governments on both small levels and large, smaller grants, discretionary via the embassies, larger and smaller via some of the national initiatives that you may see. And on a large basis, ASHA, at least in the United States, for schools and hospitals. And that will do it for governments. What do we want to pay attention to with mega foundations? Probably the biggest thing that I want is just for you all to be aware of them. When you have time to find out what they care about and when you find out where there's overlap, because you never know where it might impact you. Now, generally speaking, I'm telling you what you already know, but these mega foundations give big money for big needs and problems. For example, they want to conquer AIDS. They want to conquer malaria. Occasionally, they'll pick out even an issue like Catholic Sisters. The Conrad N. Hilton Foundation has dedicated hundreds of millions of dollars to the promotion of Catholic Sisters. That is absolutely rare to see a mega foundation completely dedicated to something that specific in our Catholic missionary universe. But there you have it. They do that. But a lot of times they look on very big issues having to do with access to education, a variety of issues in healthcare. We just talked about a few of them. But generally speaking, the grantees need to have big capacity. And as individual missionaries, we rarely have that because we're in one particular mission area dealing with the population at hand. And they tend to be smaller projects. So I would say you look at the possibility of what's called a derivative grant. And we talk about it and explain it in the book as well. But a derivative grant, from the root word, it's derived from other grants. So here's an example of how an AIDS hospice in Zambia received a fairly large grant without specifically applying for it from the foundation that gave the money in the first place. The Gates Foundation wanted to deal with AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. Gates then contacted a large NGO, Doctors Without Borders. Doctors Without Borders was then in partnership with a lot of other organizations. One of them is Catholic Relief Services. And then Catholic Relief Services was aware of this hospice, which dealt with dying patients in Lusaka, and was able to put them on their radar when they made that aware to Doctors Without Borders. Doctors Without Borders was able to confirm that it was within the scope of the grant that the Gates Foundations gave to them. So actually, the Gates Foundation money ended up at this relatively small hospice in Lusaka. But it came via first Doctors Without Borders and then Catholic Relief Services. So I asterisk here, it's good to know how these mega foundations are active in your country. In this case, it really rather happened by accident. But if the hospice had known about it, they could have made CRS aware. And in this case, CRS was aware, and then made Doctors Without Borders aware. And then they were able to get permission to use the Gates Foundation money for that. So I also say it's good to know what they're doing, but it's also good to be known. And that goes back to, I will talk about this towards the end of the series, but your whole communication strategy, wherever and whenever possible, via the internet, via whatever groups that you have, via whatever publications you have, to spread the word about what you're doing. You never know when it's going to hit the right person and help fill a need. So that's it on mega foundations. I don't want to make too much of them because as missionaries will probably seldom have a chance to apply directly. But there may be opportunities down the road because they're clearly supporting the things that you do in healthcare, in education, in human rights, around issues around migrants, refugees, homeless, and the like. They do care. You've got to try to find the connection between the downstream partners that they're funding. So that's it for mega foundations. Now we'll move on to what I would call bonus funders. You know, we've gone through a lot, and this book will list them all. But, bonus funders to be aware of. I talk about other congregations. We list a few congregations in the book. They usually tend to support only members of their congregations around the world. But I do believe you're going to see more and more where congregations are using some of the money that they have as their numbers go down. So if we played out, this line is for time. If you go out in time, congregations are going to have, many Catholic congregations are going to have fewer members. And I'm specifically referring to congregations and their North American and European populations. And because of that, they're going to have reduced expenses, which will give them more money available. So we specifically had one congregation of sisters here in the United States that is literally planning on, quote, going out of business, if you will. They're down now to less than 100 members. They believe in the next 10 to 15 years, it will be just a handful. And so they have set aside funds. It's acting like a foundation. And they say, we want to be co-missionaries with those congregations of sisters, priests, and brothers who are in the countries that we used to be in, but we can't be in now. And they actually have processes like that. I think you will see more of them, but keep your eyes and ears open for that with other congregations. In-kind gifts. There are some fairly large operations out there that may not be able to write direct grants, but can give you other items that you care about. Feed My Starving Children is an operation out of Minnesota in the United States that literally gives with each shipment. Its starting amount is about 260,000 meals. It was specifically designed for people on the higher end of the malnutrition scale, and they have a very long shelf life. So if you can afford and work it out to get the shipment to your country, It's a very meaningful impact. Catholic Medical Mission Board, they make shipments for missionaries in the United States and Europe that are going in country. They'll give you medicines that you can use to take to the people there. In some instances, they may ship. They often have in-country representatives too, but they have become very successful at working with the large pharmaceutical companies to get humanitarian amounts of medicines that are particularly important and maybe otherwise unavailable in the countries where you're at. Food for the Poor. They're one of the largest NGOs in the world, period. And their support all around the world is very, very significant. None of these will probably make direct grants of cash, but if you have the network, you can do great work working with them. I would say this, it doesn't really maybe help you to know this, but there are many, many small family foundations that we are unable to find and put in this book. And even when we do find them, they ask that we don't list them in the book. Because they have smaller amounts of money to give away right now, they feel that they would be absolutely inundated by grant requests. So they tend to operate on a friend-to-friend or personal connection basis. But they are out there, and I want you to be aware of that. And I believe those will increase over time, and hopefully they increase in size over time such that they're then willing to be put in our book. But we're aware where we can be of that, and we do continue to try to find ways to put some of those in there. And then finally, this book does have operations partners. That is to say, you will find agencies listed in here that work on transport. They work on travel. Believe it or not, there are a couple that are dedicated just to finding discounted airfares for missionaries. So they're in there as well. There's a number that provide technical support, financial management, agriculture support, and advice. A lot of this would be what you would otherwise maybe pay several $1,000s for a consultant. They offer either with people in the field or connected via Zoom calls and other communication methods, real genuine value and real qualified value in terms of real engineers, doctors, agronomists, people that will give you very significant advice.